So, howdy folks, welcome to this afternoon's session on hallucination. I am going to be the first speaker. I'm going to speak for 35 minutes, and then we'll have a short period of questions to last no more, so that my session lasts no more than 45 minutes in total, and then we'll pass over to Heather, and then Alex, and then Ricardo. And so our session is on hallucination. So first of all, thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to be here. This is my first attendance at this conference, and I'm enjoying it thoroughly thus far. Okay, so the standard account of the sensory experiences that are had in dreams is that they are wholly hallucinatory. However, recently it's been argued that some dream experiences are not wholly hallucinatory, they contain perceptual elements. And I agree with this. The sorts of evidence that people point to are things like if you put a pressure cuff on a dreamer's arm or leg, then that increases the reports of dreams involving the limb in question. If you spray dreamers with water while they're dreaming, this increases the reports of dreams of rain or water or such like. So recently I proposed a new theory of illusion and hallucination. Early work done on that theory was with Claire Batty, who's at the University of Kentucky, and subsequently I've developed that further. Now I think the success of a theory should be judged, at least in part, by its ability to explain and predict phenomena. And in the past, I've argued that my theory can explain accounts of olfaction, theories of binding, indirect perception, the nature of virtual reality, and other exciting cases. Today, what I want to argue is that the theory gives a good account of dream experiences that have perceptual elements that people have already identified in philosophy and psychology, and also that it predicts other kinds that people haven't discussed before. Okay, so the structure of the talk is as follows. First of all, I'll tell you about what the traditional theory within philosophy is of illusion and hallucination. Then I will introduce my new theory of illusion and hallucination, and by that point we'll be about at the midway point in the talk. And then I'm going to talk about perception in dreams and how you can apply my theory to perception within dreams, both to explain existing cases people talk about and to posit and explain new cases that people could start looking for. So in all my examples today, I'm just going to assume that colours and shapes are mind-independent properties of objects that it's possible to perceive veridically or have illusions of or have hallucinations of. If you disagree, then just substitute whatever mind-independent properties you think there are that we can perceive and have illusions of or hallucinations of. Okay, so here's the traditional account of illusion and hallucination. So the core notion of these is pretty much agreed by everyone, at least within the discipline of philosophy. It's that in illusion we are perceiving something, but not as it is in one or more respects. And in hallucination we fail to perceive something, but nonetheless we have an experience in which it seems to us as if we are perceiving. So I don't take issue with this. I agree with these core notions. What I do take issue with is that the way that standardly in philosophy people have gone on to spell out these notions. So these notions have been spelled out in detail in one particular way, a way which all researchers, as far as I know, have accepted, but it's a way that I don't accept. So here's the standard philosophical definition of illusion. So in illusion, you perceive some worldly object. When I say a worldly object, I mean tables and chairs, physical objects out there in the world in front of us. I'm saying worldly object to distinguish those sorts of objects from perhaps special mental objects called sense data that philosophers have posited. So I'm not talking about mental objects, I'm talking about physical objects in front of us. So the traditional account of illusion is that you perceive a worldly object, but you attribute to it one or more properties that it does not have. So just to give you a simple example, you might see a blue car, but because of the strange street lighting, you have an experience as of a purple car. So you're seeing the car, you're getting lots of its properties right, perhaps you're seeing its shape accurately, its location accurately, and so on. But you inaccurately experience the colour of the car. Perhaps you experience it as being purple when it's really blue. That would be the standard account of illusion. And here's the philosopher A.D. Smith, who says illusion is any perceptual situation in which a physical object is actually perceived, but in which that object perceptually appears other than it really is. And here's the traditional account of hallucination. You have an experience as of an object and its properties, but there is no worldly object and there are no worldly properties that you perceive in virtue of having that experience. So, for example, you might have an experience as of a blue car, but in virtue of having that experience, you're not seeing a blue car or any other worldly object. Okay, so on to then why I think this view is not right and what my new theory of illusion and hallucination is. So I think that these traditional views are what I'm going to call metaphysically parochial. In other words, I think that they do outline some forms of illusion and hallucination, but I think that there are so many more other types out there that these traditional views fail to capture and that my view does capture. So I think there are far more types of illusion and hallucination than the traditional views of these tell us that there are. So according to my view, there can be veridical perception, illusion, and hallucination of properties. And in addition, there can be veridical perception, illusion, and hallucination of objects, qua objects, right? Not in virtue of getting their properties wrong or anything like that, but qua objects, there can be veridical perception, illusion, and hallucination of objects. So let me explain in more detail to you why I think this. So in veridical property perception, I take it that we're perceptually sensitive to the properties of an object and we experience them as they are. So you're looking at a blue car and you experience it to be blue, and indeed it is blue, and you're perceptually sensitive to, let's say, the colour, such that if the car changed colour, your experience would alter, you're able to discriminate the blue from other colours and so on. So then what are illusion and hallucination of properties on my view? Well, if you have an illusion of a property, then I would say that you must be seeing it. If it's illusion, remember back to that core notion of illusion, you must really be seeing the property, just in some sense not as it actually is. So in other words, I think that you must be, in cases of illusions of properties, perceptually sensitive to the property in question. So for example, suppose you put on dark glasses and you're looking at a light blue car, you might have an experience as of a dark blue car. For me, that's a property illusion. You would be sensitive to the colour of the car. If the car changed colour, your experience would alter. You're able to tell apart that colour from other colours. But you're not experiencing the car exactly accurately. You're experiencing it as a little bit darker than it really is. So you're perceptually sensitive to the colour, you're just not experiencing it accurately. That, to me, is property illusion. And compare that to the following case, a case of property hallucination. In property hallucination, I would argue, you're not perceptually sensitive to, say, the colour. You're not seeing the colour. Nonetheless, you may be having an experience of colour. So let's suppose that here you are, strapped in your chair, looking at a light blue car, and at the same time, some evil visual scientist is zapping area V4 of your visual cortex that we think is responsible for colour vision, and that causes you to experience the light blue car not as light blue, but as purple. And let's suppose that the colour that you experience is completely random, just based on whatever the scientist happens to be poking about with his electrode in your V4. In this kind of case, you're not perceptually sensitive to colours. If the car changed colour, your experience wouldn't alter. It would keep the same as long as the scientist was doing what he's doing, he or she is doing to your brain. And for me, this is a case of property hallucination. You're not perceptually sensitive to the colour of the car, yet you're having an experience of it as being coloured. Okay, so I always like a good table. I think tables are good guides to thinking through the shape of things. So if you think of hallucination as being down in this bottom right-hand cell, so this is the traditional account of hallucination. You hallucinate an object and you hallucinate its properties. Here's veridical perception. You perceive an object and you have veridical perception of one of that object's properties experienced as belonging to that object. The traditional case of illusion says you have illusory perception of one of an object's properties experienced as belonging to it. And then what I've introduced here is this notion of hallucination of a property as experienced as belonging to an object. Now, these are very long-winded ways of saying what I'm saying, but it will become clear why I want to put things in exactly this precise way in one moment. Okay. So as soon as you have a table like this, at least if you're a philosopher, the mind boggles and you start to think, well, are these all the options? For example, are there other options available? Well, we'll come back to see that indeed there are. So let's leave talk of properties just for a moment and think of objects. So it's uncontroversial that one can perceive objects and that one can hallucinate objects. It's just part of the standard view. But I think that we need to distinguish between veridical perception of an object, qua its objecthood, and illusory perception of an object, qua its objecthood. So I don't mean here veridical perception of an object, meaning you're perceiving all its properties accurately, and illusory perception of an object, meaning you're getting one or more of its properties incorrect. I'm not talking about property perception here. I'm talking about the objects themselves. So what is an illusion of an object, on my view? This is a notion that people don't talk about, qua object. Well, it would be a case where, like when you're veridically perceiving objects, you are perceptually sensitive to objects. So you're sensitive to the presence and absence of objects. But you don't perceive them veridically qua objects. So there's something skewed about your sensitivity to the nature of objects. So one form of object illusion, I would say, is double vision. In double vision, you experience two objects being present for every one object that is present. In this kind of case, you're perceptually sensitive to the presence and absence of objects. You can make lots of comparative judgments, such as there are twice as many objects here than there are here. If the number of objects changed, your experience would change. So you're perceptually sensitive to objects under this, when you have double vision, but just not accurately so. You're experiencing twice the number of objects that there are than there are. So for me, this is a case of object illusion. So in my table here, I've added this extra column of illusory perception of an object, things like double vision. And over here, we have the traditional veridical perception of an object. And of course, when you're illusorily perceiving an object, when you're having double vision, you could accurately perceive one of its properties. You might accurately perceive the color of the finger. You could have illusory perception of an object that's perceived in double vision. You might be wearing dark glasses and seeing it a bit darker than it really is. Or you could have a hallucination of the property of an object that's seen in double vision, such as if an evil scientist was zapping your visual cortex V4. Okay, so what about these cases here? Would it be possible to hallucinate an object, yet have veridical perception of one of that object's properties experienced as belonging to that object? Now, that's quite a lot to get your head around. I will take this slowly for you and explain it to you. Well, I think that there are such cases, at least if you make one sort of important assumption. But to get to ourselves seeing that kind of case, I want to introduce some other cases to you. So I noted here that this is quite a long-winded way of saying what's going on in this kind of case, right? So you're veridically perceiving an object, so you're sensitive to the presence and absence of objects, and let's say you don't have double vision, you just see one object you experience one object for every object that's out there, and you have veridical perception of one of that object's properties experienced as belonging to it. Of course, there could be a different kind of case, as I'll argue, in which you could have veridical perception of a different object's properties experienced as belonging to a first object that you are perceiving qua object. So let me explain that case to you. So let's suppose that you're perceptually sensitive to the color of one object and you attribute it to a different object. So in this example, let's suppose that you're standing out here in the world looking at a blue car. There's also a tomato in your visual field. Let's suppose that you see the car accurately in terms of its shape and its location and so on. But let's suppose that you don't experience its color accurately. Instead, the color that you experience the car as having is the color that the object in front of you, the other object in front of you has, in this case a tomato. So you experience the car as being red because you're sensitive to the color of the tomato. Now, you might sort of start to think, hang on a minute, Fiona, you've kind of jumped the shark here, haven't you? Like, aren't we off now in philosophical flights of fantasy that bear no relationship to sort of real experiences? Well, absolutely not. So there are real-life examples of this that are studied in psychology, and they're called cases of failure of binding. So the classic example of failure of binding is that you're shown, say, a red square next to a green circle, but because you're shown these very briefly, that's not what you experience. You experience a green square next to a red circle. So the standard view of illusion would say here, well, you're having an illusion, sure, because you're getting the property of the square wrong. You're experiencing it as green when it's really red, or you're experiencing the property of the circle wrong. You're experiencing it as red when it's really green, so there's illusion going on here. But that view doesn't capture the important fact that you do seem to be actually experiencing the greenness of the circle. You just don't experience it as the greenness of the circle, you experience it as the greenness of the square, and vice versa for the redness of the square and the circle. So in my view, we can explain this. You're perceptually sensitive to the colour of one object, say the circle, but you experience it as belonging to, and therefore in some sense illusorily, belonging to the square. Okay. So I think it's a kind of merit of my approach which allows you to mix and match different elements, that you get to explain this case far more accurately than the standard view of illusion can in philosophy. So here in this cell down here, you have veridical perception of an object, and you have veridical perception of another object's property experienced as belonging to that object. And of course, you could have another case where you're wearing dark glasses when you are undergoing this, and you, oh, sorry, that's not right. Let me start again. So you could have a veridical perception of another object's property experienced as belonging to an object. And of course, you could have that kind of case when you have double vision. You might experience another object's property as adhering to the surface, if you like, of an object that you're experiencing in double vision. Right, so now what about this bottom right-hand square? This is supposed to be a hallucinatory experience of an object and veridical perception of another object's property experienced as belonging to that object that you're hallucinating. Well, again, I think there can be such cases. So here's the case. You perceive the colour of one object and you attribute it to a hallucinated object. So imagine that there's a scientist who from time to time zaps your brain, and that causes you to have a visual hallucination, and let's suppose that on this occasion you hallucinate a pig. Let's suppose that at that moment, though, you remain perceptually sensitive to the object that is in front of you in the world, in this case a green house, and you detect, you're perceptually sensitive to the colour of that object, but you attribute that colour to the hallucinated object, thus giving you an experience of a green pig. Okay, so I think that that's this kind of case. And now once we have this kind of case sort of on the table, we can now think of how we can find cases in the top right corner of the table here. In order to have these cases, you need to make one assumption which is somewhat controversial. So I don't want to say that it's true that this assumption is true, merely that if this assumption is true, then you can find cases of this sort. So you have to think that you can experience particular objects in a hallucination, that you can experience, say, the Golden Gate Bridge or the Wallace Monument, that you can hallucinate that such an object is present when it's not. So here's the sort of case I have in mind. Let's suppose that you perceive, like the last case we discussed, you perceive the colour of one object and you attribute it to a hallucinated object, but where the object you're hallucinating is the very object that you're seeing. So, let's suppose that from time to time, a scientist zaps your brain and causes you to hallucinate at random. And let's suppose that you hallucinate Michelangelo's David. I assure you, by the way, that this is not pornography that I'm showing you here, just in case you were so inclined to think. Okay, so let's suppose that you hallucinate Michelangelo's David, and there just so happens to be Michelangelo's David in front of you, and you're sensitive to the colour of Michelangelo's David, and you attribute that colour to the hallucinated Michelangelo's David. Here, I argue you would have hallucinatory experience of an object and veridical perception of one of that very object's properties experienced as belonging to that object. So I think that we can put a tick in this top right-hand box, and of course you can put a tick in the box below it by just imagining a case like that where you're wearing dark glasses, where you see the colour of Michelangelo's David as being a little bit darker than it really is. Now, actually, this case here, in the sort of bottom left, or this whole row, actually there's a whole bunch of cases sort of hiding in there, really. So we can expand this table by thinking of different cases in which you either veridically, illusorily, or hallucinatorily experience another object's property, which is then experienced either veridically, illusorily, or hallucinatorily as belonging to an object. So there are a whole bunch of cases in there, which if I had longer, I would unpack and talk you through. I'm going to leave this as an exercise to the listener to think through how you can get cases of this kind. Okay. So now on to thinking about perception in dreams. So the classic theory of the sensory elements of dreams is that they are wholly hallucinatory, as I said at the beginning of my talk. So the idea is something like this. You dream that you're seeing the Wallace Monument in the bonny town of Stirling, but you aren't. You're fast asleep in Glasgow, tucked up in your bed. But in some dreams, non-hallucinatory perceptual elements seem to be present. And there are two sorts of cases that have been discussed in the literature to my knowledge. So the first case is a case discussed by Jennifer Wint in several places, not least in her wonderful book on dreaming. So she says, there are cases in which we perceive a real-world object while dreaming, yet in the dream the object is experienced as having properties that are dreamt. And there's another case, this is a case that I've talked about, I'm sure other people have talked about it too, in which we might perceive a real-world object's property and attribute that property to an object which is itself dreamt. And my new theory of illusion and hallucination, I think, can shed light on these cases and come to predict other sorts of cases. So let's start with Jennifer Wint's case. In this case, you're fast asleep dreaming, and whilst you're dreaming, you perceive a real-world object, yet when you dream of that when you experience that real-world object that you're perceiving in your dream, you attribute dreamt properties to it. So Wint says, we may proprioceptively perceive our real-world legs in our sleep, perhaps because they start twitching, but we don't dream that they're twitching, we dream that they're running fast. And Wint cites extensive empirical evidence to suggest that this sort of thing happens, and I'm happy to take that on board, and I would refer you to her work to see the evidence for that. So of this kind of case, Wint says that it's a case of property illusion. We experience our legs as running when they're really twitching. Now, of course, that would be in line, if you bought into the traditional view of illusion, that would be what you would say. You're perceiving an object, you're misattributing a property to it that it doesn't have. On the standard view, that's just illusion. But according to my theory, this could either be a case of property illusion or a case of property hallucination, depending on the further details of the case. So if you show some form of sort of perceptual sensitivity to the twitching, then it could be a case of property illusion. Here's just one sort of example of how we might sort of identify that kind of sensitivity. So let's suppose that when your legs twitch slowly, you experience yourself in your dream as walking slowly. When your legs twitch more quickly, you experience yourself as walking quickly in your dream. When your legs twitch very quickly, you experience yourself as running. That, to me, would be a case of property illusion. You're sensitive to this twitching in your legs. Of course, you're not experiencing it as twitching, you're experiencing it as these different stages of walking and running and so on. So this, then, would be a traditional case of illusion. You're veridically perceiving an object, your legs, but having illusory perception of one of their properties experienced as belonging to, you experience your legs as running when they're really twitching. Now, if you failed to show perceptual sensitivity to the twitching, then it would be a case of property hallucination. So suppose that when your legs twitch, this prompts you right enough to dream of your legs, but you're insensitive to the kind of twitching that's going on, and the twitching doesn't determine which property you experience your legs as having in your dream. So let's suppose that sometimes when your legs twitch, you dream that your legs are running, sometimes you dream they're painful, sometimes you dream they're cold, when in fact they're none of those things. This kind of lack of perceptual sensitivity would mean on my account that such cases are property hallucination. So we'd get this yellow square filled in. So now on to the sort of case I've discussed in the past. These are cases in which we might veridically perceive a real-world object's property and attribute that property to a dreamt object. So this actually happens to be quite often. I have a really nasty alarm clock, and I have to have a really nasty alarm clock. It makes this horrible beeping sound because I'm dreadful at getting up in the morning. So I have this alarm clock, and quite often, just before I wake up, I start dreaming that there's a lorry reversing. And as I'm sort of then slowly sort of come out of my sleep, I realise, my alarm's going off. So what I think is going on in this case is that I'm dreaming that there's a lorry present. I'm accurately detecting a property of my alarm clock, that it's producing this sound, and I'm attributing that property to the dreamt object, to the lorry that seems to me in my dream to be present and reversing. So the sound that we experience in this sort of case could be veridical with respect to the sound of the alarm, but of course it might be distorted in some way. Perhaps your head's half under the pillows and so you're hearing the sound is a bit more muffled than it really is, and so on. So this then, I think, gives us cases where we have veridical or illusory experience of another object's property, the alarm, experienced hallucinatorily as belonging to the lorry which is dreamt. So it's kind of interesting that whilst we can imagine these kinds of cases in the philosopher's flights of fancy, we can also then go out into the world and see that there do seem to be real-world cases that answer to what seemed to be just a philosopher's flight of fancy to begin with. So all these cases in yellow are cases I've discussed thus far of perception in dreaming. All these orange cases are cases that my theory would predict could be other cases of perception in dreaming. I want to end just by discussing one final case. This is the case of veridical perception of an object and veridical perception of one of that object's properties, experiences belonging to that object, but where that object and its properties that you're accurately experiencing are experienced within your dream. So the example is as follows. We veridically perceive a real-world object and, let's say, one or more of its properties while we're dreaming. So suppose that we auditorily perceive a real-world alarm clock and its property of producing a ringing sound, and we experience this as being in a dreamt shop in which we seem to be standing. So I'm dreaming, I seem to be in a shop, let's say a supermarket, and suddenly, whilst seemingly while I'm dreaming, I suddenly experience that my alarm, let's say, is on the shelf in the shop behind my head and it's producing the ringing sound. Now, you might wonder in this kind of case whether the experience of the alarm in the shop is a case of perception in dreaming, or is it just a simultaneous case where you're both dreaming and perceiving? Like, is there some reason to think that it's a case of perception in dreaming? Well, I think that there can be cases of simultaneously dreaming and wakeful experience, but I don't think that this is the right account of the particular case I've just described. So let me explain why. Well, there are sort of two properties that I think are vital to consider here. One, although you're auditorily aware of your alarm and its properties, you're not aware of anything else in the real-world environment. You're not aware, in the case I've discussed, of your bed, the covers, the smell of toast, and so on that's really in your environment. You're experiencing the alarm and its properties not as being in your actual environment, but in the dream environment, in the shop that you're dreaming you're in. And I think that these facts matter greatly. So one way to see that is to sort of go and look at Jennifer Wint's definition of what a dream is. So I find this very plausible. She says, dreams occur when the phenomenal here and now is located no longer relative to a largely veridical perceptual environment, but rather relative to an alternative, largely internally generated environment, the so-called dream world, that is at best weakly constrained by external stimuli and hence hallucinatory. So I think this is a good account of dreaming. And if it's right, then one's experience should be classified as a dream, so long as the experienced location of objects, such as the alarm that you're perceiving, is in the dream world. So now, what does it really mean to say that you're experiencing the alarm as being in the dream world? Well, in the case I described, the alarm is experienced not just as having the property of producing a ringing sound, but it's also experienced as having the following sorts of properties. Being in the dreamt shop, right? It's on the shelf behind your head. Being to the left of the dreamt tomatoes, so it bears spatial relationships to objects that are dreamt. And say, being at the same height as my dreamt head position. So I might think in my dream that I'm standing up and that the alarm is right behind my head. Of course it isn't, right? I'm lying down and my alarm's in a slightly different location relative to my head. So these sorts of properties that are attributed to the alarm in the dream bind the alarm experience to the dream world. Now let me explain a little bit in more detail what I mean by binding. So people talk about binding when it comes to cross-modal experiences. That is experiences that involve more than one sensory modality, like, say, vision and audition. So I've talked about this, Casey Callahan has talked about this. So we've both argued that cross-modal experiences come in two sorts of kinds. There are unbound kinds. This would be cases in which you have experiences in different modalities that are had at the same time, but that could be had alone. So, for example, let's suppose that you see a boat and at the same time you feel something hot in your hand. It seems like, on another occasion, you could see a boat without feeling anything hot on your hand, or you could feel something hot in your hand without seeing a boat. Those experiences seem to sort of come apart without remainder. Yes, you're having them both at the same time, but you can have one without the other. Those are unbound experiences. On the other hand, some cross-modal experiences, I think, are bound experiences. They involve they're experiences that involve two different modalities, but those experiences aren't decomposable into two parts, each of which could be had alone without remainder. So, for example, I think sometimes you can experience that the object that you are seeing is the object that you're hearing. It's not just that you see an object and hear an object. What you experience is that the very object that you're seeing is the object that you're hearing. In that kind of case, I would say those experiences and those properties are bound together in a special way. And I think that the dreaming case under consideration is very similar. The alarm that you're hearing is bound to the space that the objects that you're dreaming seem to be in. You experience the alarm not just at the same time as experiencing the dream world, but you experience the alarm to be located in the dream world, to have a position relative to the dreamt tomatoes, and so on. So that's why I think it's right to say that this experience is a dream experience, albeit a perceptual element inserted into dreaming. But now consider a different case. Suppose the alarm is experienced as being in the real world, whilst at the same time you experience a dream world. Then I would say there is good reason to say that the alarm experience is not a dream experience. It's simply a wakeful experience that accompanies your dreaming experience. And now we might ask, well, does that ever happen? Reports suggest that it does, and that it sometimes occurs in hypnagogia. That's the transitional state between wakefulness and sleep in which one experiences hallucinations. So in one study, people with hypnagogic visual hallucinations reported that they were also, at the same time as having these visual hallucinations, able to have ordinary perceptions at the same time. This person had a visual hallucination of a dream world. They were actually sort of visually dreaming that they were standing in front of a ship. But at the same time, they were talking to and hearing the experimenter who was in the room beside them. And studies of hypnagogia also suggest that a dreamt object can be experienced as being located in the waking world. So that's like the opposite case of the case I was describing. So one woman reported her hypnagogic experience as being as of the room being full of angels. So she was seeing the room around her, but at the same time she was hallucinating, dreaming these angels as being in the real world. The angels would experience as being in the waking perceived world, and thus bound to it in the sense I've articulated. And one should note that these kinds of reports are very similar to the kinds of reports of a lot of clinical hallucinations of objects, such as occur in Parkinson's disease, in which people experience hallucinated objects as being in the sort of real world space that they're perceiving. Okay, so I have therefore disambiguated three types of cases: a perceived waking world object being experienced in the dream world, a dreamt object experienced in the perceived waking world, and perception of the waking world in a dream of a dreamt world occurring simultaneously. And the first case that I was talking about, the case of dreaming, the case of experiencing the alarm and its sound, which you're producing as being in the shop, is a case of type 1. And we can capture this on my table. So vis-a-vis the alarm and its production of the ringing sound, that's veridical perception of one of the properties of the alarm, which you're really hearing. And at the same time, you're having a hallucination of a property of the alarm. You're hallucinating that it's in the shop. You're hallucinating that it's to the left of the dreamt tomatoes, and so on. And again, although this is quite a complex experience, we can capture it nicely within my framework. As I said, there are many more cases that we could think through if we had time, but I'm going to stop there. So just to conclude, what I've argued for is that my new theory of illusion and hallucination identifies a variety of illusory and hallucinatory phenomena, and we can find examples of these in cases of perception in dreams. My theory helps us explain the examples that have been already posited in the literature, and in fact refines them in important ways. And my theory helps us predict and explain further examples of perception in dreams that haven't been thus heretofore identified. I would just like to end out by giving a shout out to the perception census that Anil Seth mentioned earlier. This is a large online citizen science investigation of perceptual diversity, including dreams. A link is up here. If you would like to go and take part, we'd be very grateful. Thank you very much.